The north and the south form the larger setting of the land between, and each dramatically influences this small land of the eastern Mediterranean. Our questions are, how do the north and south differ, and how do they affect the land of the Bible? To begin addressing the first question, let's ask the second. What are the differences in terrain between the north and the south? Across the north runs a high, uplifted range of mountains. The range twists like a serpent between Europe and Asia. It disappears within the deep depression of the Aegean basin, and only the Aegean's ragged shoreline and mountaintop islands testify to the submerged range. Two large islands, Crete and Cyprus, clearly mark the southern mountainous outline. Mountains rise again into Anatolia's two ranges and then bend southeast to form a formidable barrier between the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia and the arid plains of Persia. In contrast, a broad swath of arid desert covers the south. The Sahara is an immense barrier which tends to isolate North Africa from Greater Africa further south. The Arabian Desert is also a major obstacle, and only the most determined dare to cross it. Between the two large deserts lies the Sinai Desert. The greatest difference between north and south, however, has to do with rainfall. What causes this climatic difference? The northern storm belt produces ample rainfall in much of the north, especially on the mountainous heights. The green pattern on the map represents rainfall above 300 millimeters, 11 inches or more, enough for agriculture. Rainfall quickly decreases to the south until it becomes insignificant. This results in the South's vast and varied deserts, such as the sandstone desert of Wadi Rum, on the border between modern-day Jordan and Saudi Arabia, or the combination of limestones and chalks standing near the desert oasis of Kadesh Barnea, or the deep sands found along the route to Egypt in the northern Sinai, or the exposure of the great Afro-Arabian plate in the granite deserts around the Red Sea. These varied deserts result from the lack of rainfall and stand between the wet north and equatorial rains beyond the southern limits of this map, rains which produce the waters of the Nile River. The difference between the wet north and the dry south creates vastly contrasting conditions for settlement, security, and trade. How does rainfall, or lack of it, affect life in north and south? Over the millennia, northern farmers tilled fertile soils. Here, within the southern pattern of arable green, soils in sufficient rainfall produce delightful agricultural settings, such as near the Labona Valley, a day's walk north of Jerusalem. Villages and cities arose across the green belt of the north. Examples abound, but let a few suffice. On the Peloponnesus, Mycenae looks over the fertile Argolian plain as it descends toward Argolis Bay. Even though this picture shows the yellow of the dry season, olives and greenery below Corinth's Acropolis bespeak the land's fertility. Forested slopes surround Delphi, high in the mountains of mainland Greece. On the western coast of Anatolia, or Asia Minor, alluvial-filled river valleys run westward toward the Aegean. This view, near Pergamum, looks across the agricultural valley of the Caicus River. Farther south, Sardis sits in the rich Hermus River valley. In the next valley south, Ephesus, near the mouth of the Cayster River, also enjoyed the blessing of alluvial soils and sufficient rainfall. One more valley south, from the site of Priene, we look across the lush Meander River valley toward Miletus. These valleys also served as roads to the interior, and trade routes bustled with activity. From central Anatolia, the forested slopes of the Cilician Gates offered one of the main passes to ports on the northeastern Mediterranean. Lack of rainfall, however, restricted southern occupation to springs and water holes. Here Bedouin women draw water from a well in the biblical Negev, a border region between the farming and herding cultures. Southern occupation may also exist at higher elevations, which force the last bit of moisture from an infrequent passing storm. The setting for this picture is within the finger of green, reaching south along Edom's heights. Behind the green valley of Wadi Musa stands the sandstones that secure the Nabatean site of Petra. Nomadic herdsmen controlled water, security, and trade, and thus ruled much of the arid south. In addition to the rainfall factor that we have seen, what else affects land use and settlement? Major river valleys transform both the north and the south. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers originate in the north's mountains. They flow south, bringing both water and soil to the otherwise arid plains of Mesopotamia, and then turn southeast to the Persian Gulf. City-states and empires arose along these rivers from the region of Aram through the Assyrian homeland to Babylon and the river deltas, which now extend far beyond their ancient limits. Here, with the literary texts of Sumer, history began, at the foot of the mountainous north, but also on the edge of the Arabian desert. By contrast, arid regions in the south lack political potential. But how then did Egypt arise and thrive in the arid south? The Nile River flows north from Africa's interior and provides a long, narrow, verdant strip through the Sahara. Political centers emerged along the Nile, one at Luxor, or Thebes, in Upper Egypt, supported by the sheer immensity of the Nile, with its ceaseless water flowing through vast deserts. The annual rising and falling of the Nile left deposits of fertile soil along its narrow valley where agriculture and wildlife flourished. These mountains along the west bank of the valley protected the famous Valley of the Kings. Here some of Egypt's greatest pharaohs were buried with all that was thought necessary in afterlife. From these heights one gains a view in the opposite direction, over the west bank and its ancient structures to the river Nile, and to temples which stood in timeless dignity along its east bank. The impressive facade of the Luxor temple allows entrance into a maze of columns and polished statues. A few minutes to the north is the Karnak temple, where one can roam among massive columns in the hypostyle hall in front of the central court and sanctuary. As the Nile continues its journey north through the desert and toward the Mediterranean, it arrives at another major center, the area of Memphis in Lower Egypt. Here Egypt's old kingdom emerged over 45 centuries ago, and grand funerary pyramids arose in the sands along the Nile Valley. Nearby, the vigilant Sphinx, protective of this early Egyptian empire, still raises his head in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, as it has through all subsequent periods. The Nile's journey, however, does not end here. It divides into numerous streams. Its flow slows, and its waters deposit rich soils over an ever-increasing delta where fields, palms, ponds, and moderate climate all combine to create one of the world's most concentrated agricultural regions. Desert sand, however, is never far away, and its incessant encroachment appears along many fields and from various vistas above the delta floor. Were it not for the Nile, fed by the waters of the African interior, these surrounding sands would have long ago engulfed the Nile Valley and this broad delta. Nothing compares to the Nile in the midst of sprawling deserts. And nothing, in either north or south, compares to Egypt's empires which began along the banks of the Nile, strong, rich, and secure within their inhospitable surroundings. So how did Egypt affect ancient Near Eastern policies and politics? Like powers in Mesopotamia, Egypt's kingdoms changed the course of history through empire-building campaigns. Pharaohs recorded these campaigns on stone inscriptions along the Nile. This relief on the southern wall of the Karnak temple celebrates victories in the land between by Pharaoh Shishak, founder of Egypt's 22nd dynasty. The god Amun, identified by his double-plumed headdress, holds the ropes of captive cities in his left hand, while Asiatics kneel before him with hands raised in supplication. The biblical book of Kings tells us that Shishak's campaign occurred soon after the time of King Solomon and his wealth-gathering reign. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Solomon's son, Shishak, king of Egypt, advanced against Jerusalem. He took the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king's palace. All of it he took. The inscription traces the Egyptian advance through Gaza on the coast, then inland via Gezer and past the lowland cities of Rebute and Ayalon, to access the Kirithaim and Beit Horon ridge routes, which brought the Egyptian forces to Gibeon on Jerusalem's doorstep. The rest of Shishak's city list reveals his main goals: to destroy the infrastructure built by David and Solomon, a network of sites that had deflected east-west trade away from Egypt, and to reassert Egyptian influence northward to the region of Aram. A question arises: how did the armies of imperial Egypt reach these northern regions? The lands along the eastern Mediterranean offered an impressive land bridge to the region of Aram and the powers of Mesopotamia beyond. Great natural barriers defined the land bridge: the Mediterranean Sea to the west, a barrier for all but sailors who exploited its sea lanes as maritime highways, and the Arabian Desert to the east, open only to caravan drivers who learned to navigate its arid paths. The land of the Bible lies between these barriers. It also lies uncomfortably between Egypt and Aram. Specific passageways lead through this land between. What defines these passageways? Geological tension along the land bridge produces areas of difficulty. Lebanon's high ranges, Upper Galilee, obstacles in the Galilean Depression, the Central Hill Country, Upper Gilead and the Dead Sea region, the Southern Highlands, and the arid South. These difficulties define passageways or imperial highways which link the region of Aram and adjacent powers in Mesopotamia with Egypt in the Nile Valley beyond the northern Sinai Desert. Egypt claimed this middle ground for economic and security reasons, even though it lay beyond northern Sinai. Much of the area, however, was part of the watered and settled north, and northern powers often overran it. So what was life like along these imperial highways? Those living in this land between, the land of the Bible, were caught between two far greater power centers, often in conflict for control of this middle ground. Only when the imperial powers waned or retreated could local nations in this land between emerge and compete.